Well, hello everyone, Flip Pidot here from Open Model Project, and I'm reunited for this episode with our own in-house pollster and modeler extraordinaire, Peter Hurford. Peter, what's going on, buddy?
Hey guys, good to be back on the podcast. Sorry you had to be without me. Hopefully that won't happen too often.
Yeah, we muddled through. We had a good episode.
Yeah, it was a good episode
last week with Paul Butler talking about ranked choice voting. Anyway, here we are in inaugural week of the new presidential administration, and this is actually going to be a fun one. So we're bringing you a bit of a different format today. So return listeners will know that Open Model Project is a new election forecasting and polling platform built on the premise that radical transparency and public collaboration may pave the way towards better, more accountable political forecasting. And having debuted our interactive models and polls for the Georgia Senate runoffs, we recently turned our attention to the upcoming and hotly contested New York City Democratic mayoral primary. And you can hear more about that in our immediately previous episode with Paul Butler. But today we are reopening a painful wound that's inflicting the forecasting world such as it is. And that's the very lamentable state of opinion polling. So mainstream election forecasts are, by now, you could say, common law married to traditional polling. And safe to say that traditional opinion polling has proven itself to be a loathsome deadbeat of a partner for forecasters. So they were off, of course, in 2016, not by that much, only about a point on average, but enough to predict the wrong outcome, that Clinton would win and Trump would lose. And this is ascribed to things like faulty education weighting and other kind of demographic errors. And we were assured that they had reformed their ways. This was all fixed going into 2020. But 2020 was much, much worse. Even though the outcome it predicted, the polling predicted, was the same, they were actually off by, I think it was about 4 points versus around 1 or 1.5 points in 2016. So if you look at the 538 average, I think they had Biden winning by something like 8.5 points. And he wound up winning, I think it's about 4.5 points. So if he was off, if the polling nationwide was off by another 0.5 point, or I think exactly 0.6 points, then Trump wins Arizona, Trump wins Wisconsin, Trump wins Georgia, and you have a 269 to 269 tie, which of course means Trump actually wins a second term because Republicans control a majority of state delegations. So the polling apparatus is clearly broken would be an understatement. But today, we're going to try and weigh the pros and cons of, perhaps against our better judgment, sticking with pollsters as forecasters. Should forecasters simply kick pollsters and polling to the curb and rely on alternative data like, early voting and vote by mail data, prediction market pricing, economic fundamentals, demographic shifts? As in the previous episode, we discussed that the best performing Georgia Senate runoff forecasts were Northwestern University's Thomas Miller's, who barely uses polls at all and sometimes doesn't use polls at all. So can this relationship be mended? Is there a future between pollsters and forecasters? If so, how do these polls and polling methodologies need to be reformed, or should we just ditch them entirely? So along with Peter Hurford, who we introduced a minute ago, we also have Liam Donovan, Predicted Trader, not the cable news Republican strategist by the same name, but Peter is going to be defending the role of pollsters and polling in election forecasting, and Liam, if you like, will be prosecuting the pollsters. I will be moderating the debate, and I will be keeping score, awarding points totally subjectively, at times seemingly arbitrarily and without appeal. But at the end, I will declare a winner. So without further ado, let's kick it off. Liam, thank you for joining us. Are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, welcome, Liam. So let's start with your case here. Again, I mentioned Thomas Miller, and there's been some other pollsters that have started, other forecasters that have started to eschew the broken world of modern opinion polling in their forecasting. And of course, we are in an era now of more and more mail and absentee votes, something that won't go totally away post-COVID. It's harder to poll folks reliably, at least without as much subjectivity in the weighting and the screening, migration away from landlines, even cell phones, whatever you ascribe it to. Are polls simply irredeemably broken, and should they be cast off as the dominant input to probabilistic election forecasting?
Yeah, so the basic argument here is we have a prior for how the election is going to come out based on whatever factors like past election results, demographics, and so on. And then the question is just we have all this polling data. Do our forecasts get better or worse if we add the polling data onto our prior, right? And we can say the same thing about various other sources of data. Like we can look at donor data, we can look at early voting data, we can like fly to Georgia and ask random people what they think about the election. And so I think we need to treat all these data sources the same way, which is basically to think about we have our prior, we want to update based on some data, but presumably not every conceivable source of data, and then we have a posterior estimate. And I would argue that in general, we want our models to be simpler rather than more complex. So if there's some doubt about whether data is actually providing a signal, it's probably better to stick with the simpler model. And in general, I would argue that if you have a simpler model and a more complicated model, and the simpler one consistently achieves the same performance, we should probably prefer the simpler model. And that's just, Occam's razor, pretty common principle. So my basic argument is just that polling does not actually provide signal compared to these priors. And I think Georgia was pretty much the best possible case in terms of forecasting elections without polling, because we had great early voting data. We just had an election in November that can be used as a prior. We have a lot of data about the candidates and what kind of groups they might appeal more or less to. And I think it was pretty clear that in Georgia, polling didn't succeed. Polling did much worse. I mean, certainly did worse than my forecast. I would defend my forecast, by the way, as being better than Miller's because it was simpler. It did better, and generally, forecasts that didn't rely on polling did better than forecasts did. Now, zooming out more broadly, that's not a very compelling argument because most elections don't have the same number of data sources as Georgia did. But I would argue that we're down to like 5 to 10% response rates. And there's all sorts of variables that are very hard to weight on that are quite plausibly correlated with polling. Generally, people who believe in established institutions, who trust their neighbors, who are just generally like more social, more trusting people, also tend to respond to polls at much higher rates, which is very intuitive. And this has always been the case, but until the 2016 election, there were two reasons why this didn't actually affect polls. And the big one was that social trust simply wasn't correlated with vote choice. And then the secondary one is that response rates have been consistently declining over the past 40 years. So I would argue the basic question is we're only getting a tiny unrepresentative sample of voters with our polls. And it's very unclear how we can possibly weight these voters well enough to get an accurate traditional polling average, especially when you consider, again, that the more levers you have to weight on, the easier it is to overfit. And looking at that, I think that the pro polling case needs to provide the burden of the evidence is on the pro polling side to give reasons why this is accurate. And I just don't think you can do that looking at any of the past two election cycles.
All right. Yeah, so that's a compelling case. And I definitely have liked a lot of the work Liam has been doing. I think the biggest thing, I guess like any other debate, this will be a good debate over the burden of proof, because I would suggest that the burden of proof might be on the non-polling case to show how they can make a good model without polling. I suppose you could use just raw partisanship, like just use the past election and assume that the next election will be like the past election, but I don't think that is as predictive as polling. I haven't really seen many other models yet. I think early vote models definitely did really well in Georgia, but I think Georgia is only one of the very few states in the country that provides early vote data. And you also might want to be able to forecast the election more than like 2 weeks prior to election day. And so I think when you come down to it, you really just need polls as part of your model. And I guess I would concede to Liam, I'm giving up already, that if you have rich early voting data, yes, in Georgia, that definitely ended up outperforming polls more than I expected. I definitely am pretty interested in some of these hybrid models, but I think polls are going to remain an important component of any forecast because like it's just great when you can ask people how they're going to vote and they just tell you, and it tends to work out most of the time. And I want to be careful how we use polls. I think it's important that we're waiting for the right things. I'm happy to discuss that more. I think it's also important that we're accounting for uncertainty. A lot of people just assume that like if polls say Democrats are up 4 points, that they're going to win by precisely 4 points. They don't really have a good appreciation that there's like a 5-point margin of error, and that could mean that Democrats could very well lose by 1 point. And then even with a margin of error, there's still like a 10% chance of falling outside that margin. And that might mean that Democrats lose by even more. So we shouldn't be necessarily shocked if the polls get it wrong. But if we have a good understanding of how accurate or inaccurate polls are, we can construct odds from that like result given uncertainty. And with those odds, we can make good forecasts. And then we can combine that with other factors like partisanship, demographics, early vote data. And I would be pretty surprised if polls didn't add something important to the mix. They've been the bread and butter of every political forecast for the past 50 years. I don't think they can be dismissed easily. There's a lot of times when they're wrong, but there's also a lot of times when they're right. I think pretty much just like any other method. So I would think just because an early vote model did really well like twice or three times doesn't mean it's going to do really well every time. I think polls, their track record may not be the best, but it's a really long one. We know a lot about polls. We have decades of data about how accurate or inaccurate they are and how they capture or fail to capture. And there's a lot of innovative people coming up with ways to better handle declining response rates. I think polls are here to stay.
All right, for those keeping score at home, I'm going to award 1 point each to Liam and Peter for their opening arguments, which were both cogent and well-reasoned. But Liam, I want to go back to you because of something that Peter said, which has to do with the early polling, the early vote, the vote by mail, the absentee. Peter mentioned that in most elections, some of you might not even get early vote data in certain states, but you're not likely to get it more than a couple of weeks before Election Day. So do you concede that polls would be needed to give you a sense of the state of the race further ahead, a couple of months out from Election Day, or beyond the early vote data, or is there other alternative data that would fill the gap?
Yeah, so no, I don't concede that at all. I mean, looking at Georgia, I think our forecasts were consistently more accurate than the Open Model Project forecast. I'm just saying, right? They're more consistent. They're better than polling, because the thing is, polling also benefited from time. I believe that was my understanding, was that there was this burst of really pro-Democrat polls, at least in the last minute. I could be wrong on that. But I do know that you're right, the early voting data was important. It's only available a few weeks beforehand. But my basic argument is simply that polling does not provide a signal, right? So whatever you're using to model, whatever your prior is, polling is just going to introduce more noise than it's going to introduce. Well, it's not going to introduce any signal. It's just going to introduce noise into your forecast. And so I think that's a really basic argument that, just to go briefly back to Peter's point, that the burden of evidence should be on the non-polling side. I think it's just a really basic argument. You have like data stream X, just this mystery black box data stream. You're asking, well, should I include it in my model? The default should be no, until you have evidence that data stream X is actually correlated with what you're trying to predict in some way. And so the argument that, if you don't have early voting data, then it's harder to make a good model, that may or may not be true, but it's relevant because if polling doesn't provide signal, it doesn't matter how good or bad your model is with no polling. Adding polling still won't help, right? I'm not necessarily arguing we can predict perfectly with no polling, just that adding polling doesn't add signal. So I would say that before the election, post the election, anytime. And then just to briefly go back to other sources of data. Well, donor data is available. It's limited utility. It's available. I think the best source of data is just analyzing past elections in detail and understanding what the trends are by demographic group, and then basically applying your intuition as to how each demographic group will swing from 2016.
Peter, do you have a counter to that?
So you're saying that, let's say it's the 7th of December. We don't have any demographic data. I mean, we don't have any early vote data yet. You're saying that kind of on that day, you can just kind of read the demographic tea leaves, know that.
Well, isn't that, I'm trying to remember when I first sent you my margin predictions. I thought it was actually right around December 7th.
Yeah. What did you think the margin was then?
I believe back then I had it at Warnock plus 0.7 and then Purdue plus 0.65, which again, I think the Open Model Project was way off in Republican territory.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that and why were we way off in Republican territory. So I'm looking at our forecast now and looking at, like, one of the reasons why I was interested in December 7th is that's kind of right when our official model with all the defaults was right at the 50-50 mark for Democrats and Republicans. But
Wait,
I'm looking at,
for what does that mean? Like each one has a 50% chance to win the Senate?
yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at that, and then I'm also looking at because we have those like little cool flippers on our model, and so like if I flip it to like only polls and I discard the prior, discard the prediction market data, we actually have Warnock up like with a 62% chance of winning with like a 1.3 margin based purely on polls, and it's like adding in the prior and the prediction markets where it gets a little bit worse, and then it's also like another week of really bad polling comes in and knocks our model out where we reach like a plateau on the 18th of December where we really were not seeing Warnock winning, and then we bounce back. And so I think like I guess the question is like, is that noise or is that signal? I think there is noise. I mean, there, but I think there's also signal there. I think
Let me ask this. Let me interject. When did early voting start in Georgia, or when did the first early vote data start to become public?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't remember either. Sorry.
But I guess part of the issue is you really want most of the early vote data to be in before you make any conclusions, especially because in this case, we knew in November the Democrats tended to mail in their ballots a lot earlier than Republicans. And so I'm just trying to remember, I would guess like it wasn't until after Christmas that I actually felt comfortable saying early voting data was important and predictive.
So like basically on the 7th of December, it's like purely a demographics based model. And then like by Christmas, it can be an early vote model. And then by the actual election, and you're like all in on early voting.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat all in. Obviously, we still need to look at election day as well. So you can't go totally all in. Part of the issue for me personally is that I made a dramatic update towards the utility of early voting. I don't remember exactly when. And I don't know if you saw this, but Political Kiwi, fantastic Twitter account. I actually looked into this. I actually looked at the correlation between the black share of the early vote and the black share of the election day vote for past elections in Georgia and Louisiana, which are good because they're very, very similar percent black in the election. And they also both have runoff elections. So looking at all these past normal and runoff elections, it was clear that there was actually a positive correlation between early and E-Day, percent black of the electorate. And if you just put in like a Bayesian model with a really crude prior, you end up with around a 90% chance that the correlation coefficient is above zero. So I guess that's a bit of a digression, but my point is that I made a massive update about that. I used to think early voting wasn't very useful, and I saw this past data and I was like, wow, actually, there's this very strong correlation. And most people, often you hear people say early vote is cannibalization, but cannibalization would imply a negative coefficient. And so not only was there zero cannibalization, it was actually the opposite, where there's a positive correlation.
It's like, what do you do if a state doesn't really produce early voting data?
Well, I guess you're back to where I was, before Political Kiwi convinced me about how great early voting data was, which is just a demographic prior. And that's a really good question about so part of the issue here is that I used to think polling was pretty good. Until November 2020, my general outlook was I was still much more skeptical of polling than most people, but I generally thought it did provide signal. I thought that basically you look at the polls, you do like common sense demographic adjustments, and then you get this result that's better than the unadjusted polls, and also better than what you do if you didn't use polls at all. And that kind of worked in November and kind of didn't, and we can talk about why later. But Georgia's the only election I've actually tried to like only look at demographics, and so I'm not really sure. But I will say, just to briefly go back to polling, I think you're totally right about noise. I think if you look at something, if you look at like the log loss of my prediction versus polling every day, I think my prediction is just a lot less noisy. And it only made one big update, which was based on the early voting data.
Yeah, I suppose we just really need to start running more of this side by side. I think there's like, so it sounds kind of like we really just have one election in Georgia where our model made some mistakes and your model did well.
But we also have the November election where I put out probabilities of 538 without probabilities. And then I guess the downside is I was using polls. I think if I totally ignored polls, my probabilities would have been better. As it turned out, my probabilities did slightly beat 538s using the Green Knight test or using log loss. So I would call that like a cautious victory, but it also updated me vastly away from the utility of polling.
Yeah, and I did think you had really good general election forecast performance. I'd just be curious if like your model would be improved by polls. Like I think if I recall correctly,
I think I use polls too much. I think if I completely ignored polls, I would have done a lot better.
Well, I remember you having like forecasts like blue Texas, but that didn't really work out so well for you. And I think we would have seen that in the polls.
Oh, okay, yeah. So maybe we should talk about this right now. Go into like the specific details of why my poll-based forecasts were not very good in November.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So the basic issue was there was this consistent pattern in 2016 and 2018 that I think was first identified by David Shore, that states where Democrats were very reliant on non-college white voters, Democrats tended to do worse in reality than they did in the polls. And the argument here is just that you can wait. And this was true even after you wait for a race by education. And the argument here was basically that there's this population of low social trust non-college whites who tend to be very Republican and who also tend not to answer polls. So even if you only look at the population of non-college whites, if you look at the population of non-college whites that answer polls, they tend to be much more Democrat than the overall population. And so briefly, in a state like Georgia, Democrats don't rely on non-college whites for votes, right? They win elections even only winning like 10% of the non-college whites. But in a state like Wisconsin, it's actually important to figure out what percent Democrats get with non-college whites because over half the coalition, I understand it, over half of Democratic voters in Wisconsin are non-college. So anyways, there's this very clear story about basically Democrats rely on non-college whites. Polls always show them doing great with non-college whites, but they miss the low social trust and then the polls are biased, right? And then the flip side of this story that we saw in 2016 and 2018 was that Democrats overperformed their polls in areas with high Latino populations. So we saw this in Nevada, Arizona, and Texas in 2016 and 2018. And the argument there was basically the flip side, that there's all these Latinos who maybe don't speak English that well or just a very low socioeconomic status that polls aren't reaching, who are a very heavily Democratic group. And so when you look at like how well Democrats are doing with Latinos, you end up looking at this very high socioeconomic status English-only population that skews more towards Republicans. And so I was totally persuaded by this argument. And so I said, well, we should generally look at the polls, but we should like weight the polls more towards Republicans in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where Democrats are reliant on non-college whites, especially Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the big one where I was like quite skeptical of polling. And then the flip side was, well, in states like Texas, Arizona, Nevada, we should be weighting the polls more towards Democrats because historically polling underrates Democrats and Latinos. And I'd done a precinct analysis in 2018 that showed that the New York Times Siena poll, the gold standard poll, had Democrats doing something like 20 or 25 points worse with Latinos than they actually did in the results, right? That was where I was coming from, and that's why I had blue Texas. And so what happened basically was there was a gigantic shift among low socioeconomic class Latinos. And I actually just did an ecological regression analysis on this the other day. I was sending it to Peter, but the upshot is that in 2016, believe it or not, Democrats did something like 50 points better with non-college educated Latinos than college educated in El Paso and Hidalgo. And so that is why there was this polling error, because non-college educated Latinos are very hard to poll, and most pollsters don't weight on like Latino cross education. Now, fast forward to 2020, and this gap has mostly disappeared. So instead of this 50-point gap, it's something like a 10-point gap. And even among non-college Latinos, Latinos in precincts with less than 25,000 median income saw an average swing. There's something. It's like a hypothetical precinct with 0% under 25K would have seen a swing of 0 to a drop, and then a hypothetical precinct where every person was under 25K would have seen a swing of 40 points to a drop. So basically, non-college Latinos swung towards Trump. Latinos in areas with high immigrant population swung dramatically more towards Trump. Latinos who speak only Spanish swung dramatically more towards Trump, again, relative to Latinos overall. And even accounting for education, low-income Latinos swung dramatically towards Trump. So these are all the groups that traditionally were Democrat and hard to poll, and then they switched to being Republican and hard to poll in 2020. and I guess that's my basic summary for why my like polling plus polling adjustment model fit.
What do you think you would have predicted with like a purely demographics based poll? I mean, there's no way you would have seen Hispanics dramatically switching red without polls, would you?
So when I say that I would have done better without polls, the main thing I was doing is I was taking the national polling averages pretty much accurate because they were quite accurate in 2016 2018 for the popular vote. And then I was making these adjustments based on like my beliefs about demographics, my beliefs about polling error. So if I completely ignored polls, I wouldn't have had like a D+8 prior. I would have had more like, a D+3, D+4 prior. And I think that would have dramatically improved my forecasts in all these places. And then if you're talking about simply um, like how far off is this state from the national average, I think my Texas estimate would have been fairly similar because basically I was quite worried about a Latino swing towards Trump because I thought that the Democrats had pretty much abandoned non-college voters and ignored Latino voters. But I thought this swing would be concentrated in like places like South Texas and not these more urban, more liberal Latinos. And to me, the fact that polling crosstabs actually show Biden doing better in Texas with Latinos, better O'Rourke did, or Hillary Clinton, to me was reasonably strong evidence that this Latino.
Okay, gents, I'm going to give 1 point only to Liam for the previous segment, if for no other reason that he absolutely dominated the mic. And we know that in debates, that counts more than anything else. But Peter, I'm going to give you a chance at redemption here. I want to throw it back to you and ask you, let's stipulate that polling is completely broken. And as Liam says, it is not only more noise than signal, but completely noise, that there's basically no usable signal. But let's also stipulate to the idea that it can be fixed. It can be reformed. How can it be reformed? And backing up slightly before you answer that question, what is it, you think? Why is it broken? What's different now than, say, 10 years ago, assuming it wasn't always broken? Why is it broken now, and how do we fix it?
Wow, sounds like I'm debating both Liam and the moderator here. If I have to concede that polls have no signal and are completely broken, I definitely think even taking Liam's own forecast for the general election and updating it with like the 538 forecast, which is polls based, I get a more accurate lower Breyer score forecast. So I think Liam's still leaving some polls on the table there, but maybe he disputes that. And maybe we just need another cycle of elections to have us really go head to head. I definitely would look forward to that and definitely would like to use more of his methods. I'm not saying that he doesn't offer anything. I just think all our methods can be friends here. And you guys are the ones saying we have to throw out polls, which feels a little bit premature and non-evidenced and low sample size generalizations, but I guess we'll find out soon enough. But okay, I'll tell you some ways that I think polls can be improved, because I definitely think there are a lot of issues with polling. I think the first is just like our expectations with polls are completely wrong. Like we're expecting pollsters to nail the results absolutely precisely, and that's like never the case. I think we need to start really thinking in terms of like 80% confidence intervals or other ranges around the margin, and understand that those might be wider and kind of just be less surprised by surprising results that happen a lot. I think it's good to be taking averages of polls and like including a lot of polls and weighting them as our open model forecast did. I think it's great that we're using non-polling factors as well and really just trying to blend them together. I think we just need to get better at that. I think some ways polls themselves could be improved. I think like online polls that use like online sampling tend to get an actually pretty bad rap. I think we're actually seeing pretty reliable data from that. So we might want pollsters to stop like obsessing over calling landlines and start using more survey panels, online panels. I'd at least like a bigger mix of polling methods, trying to get signal from a bunch of different ways of reaching voters, especially when like people aren't necessarily picking up the phone. I think like we definitely need a lot more research in weighting methods. That's an area I've been really keen in. like a lot of pollsters just wait for like gender, race, education, income, and they only picked up education after 2016. I think I really would like to see more people just weighing on previous election votes. So like if we're underrepresenting Trump supporters just from the 2016 election, upsampling those dramatically increased the value of our poll. So we did a general election poll in 2020. We were about as off as everyone else, but we were definitely less off because of us upsampling kind of Trump voters from 2016. In fact, we actually would have nailed it and had one, like by far the most accurate poll in the entire cycle, if only I had accounted for the fact that people who did not vote in 2016 were also likely to be Democratic, like overly Democratic in our poll. And if I had applied the same Trump like bonus to the non-voters as well, I would have gotten like a Biden +6 instead of a Biden +9, and that would have been a much closer fit to a Biden +4. Of course, that's still just like one example, so maybe I'm overfitting. So more research would be needed there. But I also think like weighting based on social trust might be pretty valuable to do. I think we also might want to explore other ways that our polls are kind of oversampling atheists, oversampling people that are heavy social media users. Like those could be weights that we try to use more experimentally to try to kind of get at some of that more hidden vote that's not really showing up in our polls. And then I think also just kind of it might be good to jam up the sample sizes a bit, get a lot more demographic information, and really be generous with releasing that micro data. Like, I think it's shocking that we're the only pollster kind of distributing that like anonymized raw data and like really kind of providing all our code. We just need so much more transparency in polling. So much more data could be provided to people that isn't, is kind of failing a public service there. I guess you probably want some secret sauce to make it that people come and buy polls from your firm, but I still think they're being a bit stingy with us. And the Open Model Project, I think like kind of right or wrong, we deserve major kudos for our complete transparency and giving everyone the data for them to weight themselves. And if other pollsters did that, I think we could make much bigger models. Or if someone gave Open Model Project like $500,000, I think we could make much better models.
Okay, Liam, you're totally on the spot now, especially with that last line from Peter about giving lots of money to Open Model Projects. And I'm inclined, frankly, to give Peter 2 points for that very thorough response to what was admittedly very aggressive questioning, which I needed to do as Peter's teammate on the Open Model Project and not to display any egregious bias. But I thought he answered it very well and offered a very decent defense of, if not traditional current mainstream polling, at least the ideal of more reasoned, better nuanced polling going forward. So, Liam, with all you've just heard from Peter, your response, and if it differs to the extent that you feel that polling may be incurably flawed.
Yeah, so I want to draw a sharp distinction between like polls that are released by pollsters and microdata. I think that precinct level microdata definitely has some signal that you can find, right? It would be, and I think Peter said this in his opening statement, it would be very, very weird if you call up a bunch of voters and they tell you who they're going to vote for, and then that is completely useless at predicting who everyone's going to vote for, right? So just to stipulate, I agree that precinct level microdata has signal that can be found, and I disagree that polling top lines have significant signal. And I think the difference here is that Peter's talking about weighting on all sorts of esoteric factors, and in theory, some of these factors are probably correct to weight on. But the problem is we need to regularize our estimates, right? We can't just throw 20 factors in, weight on all of them, and then like correct based on the next election cycle and then try different weighting, because there's simply not enough election cycles to sort out the signal from the noise, right? It's like you have, I don't know, 20 parameters that you can control, and you only have one election cycle every 4 years to get test data. So I think that is very difficult to do. I think that in general, traditional polling relying on weights is very difficult to do. So what I would agree with is that I think my guess would be that some political consultancies have to be doing this currently. But if you had a very large database of microdata, along with reasonable, ideally like precinct level geographic locations, or at least like township level geographic locations, along with how each of those precincts or townships actually voted, I think you could probably do a pretty good job training a model on that would then be able to extract signal from future releases of microdata. Right. So I totally agree with that. I don't think that the procedure of just like looking at your microdata without a large history of microdata you can back them. Just looking at your microdata, I think we have too many idiots. I think we have, too many social media users. I'm skeptical that that would work.
I guess one other point I wanted to raise was, you said we only get one election. I mean, one election every 4 years. And I think that's true to some extent, but we have one presidential election, but we also have like 33-ish Senate elections and 435 House elections and so many other like mayors, district levels, secretary of states, attorney generals, governors. Yeah, so like we potentially have thousands of races to try to calibrate our models on. Of course, like outcomes end up being very heavily correlated. Like if you say like Georgia's going red and that the Georgia Senates are going red, they're probably both going to go blue rather than split. But like I think you may have more data to calibrate these models on than you expect. And it's kind of actually also a pity. Like 538, I think, is the only organization aggregating all this polling data, and they only have their database go back to like 2018. So I really think someone needs to invest in creating like a very large, sizable polling data set so we can really try to data mine as much as possible out of these polls.
Well, I think if it was a microdata data set, I think you could go a long way with that. I think top lines you're not going to get it.
Yeah, I definitely would really like to see that. But again, this kind of goes back to the Give Open Model Project $500,000 argument, which I might hit again just in case Flip gives me another point.
Peter, you're just trying to pad the score. I already gave you a whole point for that one. But let's revisit the scoring, because in that lengthy segment where I said I was inclined to give Peter 2 points, Liam, you did manage to claw back enough credibility with your very cogent response that I'm only going to give him 1, which leaves you both tied at 2-2. And Liam, I want to throw a question that I asked Peter back to you. Let's stipulate that polling is worse now than it has been in the past. Maybe it's that politics was less of a spectator sport a couple decades ago, less cable news, less, data journalists, less probabilistic forecasters out there, less Twitter, less social media. But again, let's stipulate. Let's say polling is further off the mark now, less reliable. There's less signal to it now than there was a few cycles ago. Liam, what is your sense as to why that is? And to what extent does that potentially illuminate the way towards improving it? And we talked at the top about whose burden of proof this is. I would say, given that your premise is that there is no signal, no usable signal in polling, I would suggest that this is somewhat more your burden to demonstrate or to argue why the signal has gone away. Or do you feel that there never was signal in the polling? It was just all we had and we didn't have these alternate data sources.
Yeah, that's a really good argument. And I think that the did used to be signal for sure. Back in 2012, Nate Silver got famous correctly predicting everything. And remember, Romney was unskewing the polls, and unskewing the polls turned out to be a total fiasco. So, yeah, it's a fair question about why I'm so confident that all the signals disappeared. And there's 2 main reasons why I think that is. I think I mentioned these before. The first is declining non-response rate. So that's very easy to quantify. And we can see that, declining response rates, increasing non-response rates. It's very easy to quantify, and we can see that they've kind of fallen off a cliff in the past, I would say, past 40 years. But then the bigger issue that probably in the past decade has contributed a lot more, even if it's harder to quantify, is is an increase in the correlation between social trust and vote choice. And we can look at this. So I think David Shore has looked into this, and he's shown that there's this correlation between how likely you are to agree with something like everyone trusts, I trust my neighbors. Generally, people can be trusted, and how likely you are to vote for Democrats. But I think that is only capturing a small portion of whatever the concept is that we call social trust. And it's just, I would say it's about, this gets into my personal political views a bit, but I would say that increasingly the key divide in American politics is between big and small, right? So you have like Democrats are increasingly the party of everything big. So big government, big business, big tech, academia, like legible frameworks of knowledge and bigness of the Democratic Party. And so then the Republican Party has become kind of this incoherent response to that, and that they're kind of everything small. So small business, small government, like local heuristics, tradition, religion. And so I think that there's this very strong correlation between being willing to trust the mainstream media, being willing to, generally give benefit of the doubt to big government, to academics and all this, and being willing to answer polls. And that's my theory, and that's also my theory for why the problem of differential non-response surged so much during the coronavirus pandemic is suddenly, basic like trust in science or trust in institutions became extremely correlated with vote choice because we had Republicans, especially Trump, talking about how the virus is a hoax. There's nothing, masks don't work, and all these things. So that created extreme polarization along like trust of institutions and social trust. And as far as what that says for the future, I think that it just says that we should be very pessimistic about polling in the future. And I alluded to this before, but the problem is there's this kind of vague concept around like bigness and trust of institutions that I don't even have the right words for. And I think that any proxy that you use to try to wait for that, like asking people if they trust their neighbors, is never going to capture the full effect. And so if you wait on, all these things that are like slightly correlated with the unknown thing that skews polls, within each group, you're still going to be skewed. So like the people that say they don't trust their neighbors and still answer polls are probably still going to be like more pro big or whatever you want to call it than the people who don't answer polls, which I think is a pretty intractable problem for any traditional weighting method, and why I'm a lot more bullish on, like machine learning.
Peter, we're going to call that Liam's closing argument, and I award him a full 2 points for it, which puts him up 4-2. We're going to give you the same opportunity to collect a maximum of 2 points. So at this point, the best you can do is tie. And we might, if you do that, throw it to the listeners to break the tie. But give us your closing thoughts, please, Peter.
I think it's pretty clear that Liam has not completely ruled out polling. I think, yes, he's cast a lot of suspicion on polling, suspicion that I share. I think polling has really taken a really rough past 4 years. We'll see if it's a Trump effect or a COVID effect or something here to stay. I think there's a lot of reason to think both, but I don't think Liam has said that polling has absolutely no signal. I think what I've been trying to advocate here is that polling has some signal and that we should use it alongside demographic priors, partisan priors, past election data, early vote data, etc. And I think the things that polls still have to add is that it's not necessarily about capturing the full effect of big versus small, but some effect of big versus small. Like maybe, like I completely agree that we have an issue where like we're trying to infer what low social trust voters who don't take polls, we're trying to infer their views from low social trust voters that do take polls. And there may be some issue there, but I do think that they're at least, even if it's not like a perfect match, they're at least directionally correlated. And we can definitely still sample their views, adjust a bit based on upweighting those low social trust voters, and then also further potentially adjust our results a bit more outside the poll. Like maybe if we think polls still are missing other hidden Republican voters, we could put like a small little smidge more Republican in our model, even if we wouldn't put in our poll. And we can learn that from other factors like demographics and fundraising and even rally attendance. I would think a lot of these things may not have as much signal either, but maybe if we mix them all together and avoid overfitting, we can come to some sort of happy compromise. But yes, I'm also wary about what Liam mentioned with Mitt Romney trying to unskew the polls. I think the polls have just been the most reliable indicator that we've had so far, and I would want to be careful that we're not just overgeneralizing from a couple hundred races in 2016 and 2020 when we've had a couple thousand races with really good polling. Maybe this is an aberration. I guess we'll see.
Well, this is terribly disappointing because that was a good enough answer that I think we need to give Peter his full 2 points as well, which leaves us at a 4-4 tie. So we're going to have to throw it to our esteemed listeners to weigh in. So how about this? Let's follow us on Twitter. We're Open Model Proj, P-R-O-J. And how about tweet hashtag Team Peter or hashtag Team Liam for 48 hours from the drop date and time of this episode. But in all seriousness, guys, Liam and Peter, this is a hugely illuminating and very useful conversation, and obviously very relevant not only to the state of polling and election forecasting and general sort of political prognosticating in this country, which obviously has come under a lot of fire, is obviously very dynamic and uncertain at this moment, and your collective thoughts about this are really, really helpful, I think, to hopefully to our listenership in general, but certainly to us here at Open Model Project as we kind of try and think about ways to, if not reinvent, then maybe reapply some of the traditional polling and forecasting methodologies and try and improve both the transparency and hopefully the accuracy and reliability that those tools can hopefully shed some light on the upcoming cycles, which of course is the whole point of this exercise. So thank you guys both for being with us. Really appreciate it. Peter, can you remind folks where to find your work online other than at openmodelproject.org?
Yeah, so there's at Open Model Proj, and then there's also at Peter Hurford on Twitter. That's Hurford at Peter Hurford. Of course, you can also join the Open Model Project Discord and chat with us there as well. And you can tell me why I'm wrong and how you would improve polling. I welcome that conversation.
Indeed. Yeah, we welcome all kinds of feedback. Openmodelproject.org will lead you to our Twitter account, to the Discord server, which Peter mentioned, which is kind of our primary communications hub. And so if you want to be part of the sausage making, interested in actually getting your hands dirty, hopefully fixing this modern polling apparatus and crafting the future of transparent open source election forecasting, we want you to come on board. So come to the site to learn how. We're hard at work currently building out our candidate dashboard and forecast, as we discussed earlier, for New York City's first ever ranked choice primary this summer for the mayoral race, starring Andrew Yang and dozens of other candidates vying to succeed Bill de Blasio. So we're going to be polling that unique race shortly and rolling out our interactive open source model as well. So if you want to be part of building that, we hope you will come join us. Liam, thank you again for joining us. Any parting thoughts?
Check out Political Kiwi.
Check out Political Kiwi on Twitter. Check out Peter Hurford.
Just to be clear, I'm not Political Kiwi. I just think that he has good analysis.
Indeed, check him out. Please get in touch with your questions, your suggested topics for future podcasts. Again, make sure to vote for this knife's edge cliffhanger score, currently 4-4 between Team Peter and Team Liam. Cast your votes with the respective hashtag for who you thought presented the more compelling argument, and we will talk with you next episode.